Hey guys, let's get started. Can you guys hear me? Hello? Test?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yep.
Great. All right, let's get started. I share my screen. The agenda is there. So we have some leftover items from last meetings. I also copy paste those items here. Okay, Ben, do you want to start on the first one?
Yeah, well, this wasn't a leftover item. This is one that I added, but if you wanted to cover it first, that's fine. So I'm kind of new to this group. I recently read the spec. I'm from NetApp, and so I'm sort of familiar with what's going on in the NetApp implementation. So what I'm trying to figure out is for some of the legacy storage protocols like NFS, iSCSI, the security mechanism for attaching usually involves some secret that exists on the node. But the way that the CSI spec is written, the sort of security setup is meant to be done by the controller in the controller publish RPC. So you need a way to get secrets that will be used for authentication from the node back to the controller. And we couldn't figure out any way to do that given the way the spec is written.
I think that if it probably doesn't work that way with Kubernetes. You will try to get the secret from the container orchestration system into the node. I think you have to think of it backwards, because the secret goes into some object that the container orchestration system contains, right?
So it depends how authentication is actually implemented. So you're right. Like if you're doing iSCSI with CHAP, you can do it that way. You can have the controller can generate the secret. It can tell the CSI controller can generate the secret. It can tell the storage controller and tell the node, and then they can authenticate to each other. But if you're doing a more legacy way of doing authentication, like
CIFS,
LUN masking by IQN, for example.
Yeah.
And then the node has an IQN that only it knows to start from, and you have to get the IQN to the controller and then to the storage device to give that node access to that particular LUN. So that there's different ways to do it, and the CSI spec is obviously opinionated about the right way is generate a secret and then push it out. But if that's not how the storage controller actually works, then you have a problem. So my two particular examples are LUN masking by IQN in the iSCSI world, and NFS exports with IP-based access control. In both of those cases, you have a piece of information that only the node knows that you have to get to the storage controller in order to implement those forms of security. And you can argue those forms of security suck, and they do, but people in fact use them. So
I see.
Ben, for the IQN, in our CSI plugin, we pass that through using the get node ID. So that function.
Yeah, so the node ID returns a string, and you can make that string be the IQN of the node if you want. But I think that's kind of gross, because I don't think that's what it was intended for.
That was some problem that we are into as well. So sounds like the get node ID maybe should be returning more information than just one string, because
yes, exactly. So strings are limited to 128 bytes in the spec, and it's not documented what you're supposed to use that node ID for. So
it's supposed to be whatever it is that the storage defines as a unique identifier for that node.
Also, in the last call, we agreed that the node ID, get node ID, will be deprecated, and we are like in the other PR that I opened. There's a new called get node info that has.
Oh, there you go.
So, yeah.
Okay, so I need to look at your PR.
Yeah.
Who is that that's speaking?
This is Hemant speaking. I'll just.
Hemant.
I'll link my PR there.
Is that the one on the next line?
No. That was discussed in the last call. It's not in the next line. I think that was already. I'm just linking it in the chat. So
does that Hemant, does that return fixed keys, or is it something that plugin can decide what to return?
Right now I think the idea was for get node info to return like any static information associated with the node. So node ID
Okay.
just returns a string, but node info, like the myPR extends that to return the existing node ID. It also returns like max volume per node, but we discussed that like any other static information we need from the node, we will
Okay.
extend this
Okay.
node info object to contain that information.
And by
So
static, you mean immutable?
Yeah, immutable. Yeah, that doesn't changes for the node. That's the plan was like. But if
so things like IP addresses of all the interfaces and IQNs and stuff could be put there.
theoretically, but
But IP addresses, I wouldn't put there because they could change, right? Unless
Well, they shouldn't change over the lifetime of the node.
well, they could if they were on the cloud. That's what I'm saying, right?
Well, but if people are doing security by IP address, which does happen in the NFS world, then changing IPs would affect existing volumes.
Okay. So let me. I kind of diverged, but let me bring it back. Yeah, I completely agree. And if your driver does that, then it should document that it's doing that. And that.
Okay,
that
so
should be there.
so this PR will probably address many. So I had another meta question, which I think is kind of answered, which is the process for amending the spec is just PRs, and then what is the approval process and the versioning? Like, how do we decide which PRs are going to get merged into which versions and what order they're going to emerge in, and when we're going to bump the version and those kinds of things?
So Ben, I can answer this one. So we do have a repo called community, and there's a governance doc kind of illustrate how to what's the kind of the way of merging a PR, submit a review, and who's going to approve the review. But we don't have a process of like say which feature or which amendment should go to which release. So that part is missing, but we do have a process for how to get a PR get merged. We do need to get approval from to at least 2 approvers.
Okay, and then when new changes are merged, do they go into effect immediately or when the next version is released?
The change will go to the next release.
Okay, so we're working towards 0.3, and we could make a bunch of merges, and then when 0.3 releases, then that'll become the official version. Okay, thank you.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, we're trying super hard to make 0.3 backward compatible with 0.2, so something to bear in mind if you're putting in a PR. If you can try to make your changes additive, then that's very helpful.
Okay, it sounds like the first issue that we can use this get no info, which is kind of useful for other things as well, and kind of looks like we have some consensus on this one. And then the action item is just trying to comment on this PR and get that things merged. All right. Next, Hammond, do you want to talk about resizing?
yeah, so there's a PR open, like if you can click on that, and so I think there's I need to format it. I haven't had chance to update. I just directly edited the the spec the CSI.proto file, so that's like a bit of a bummer, but essentially the essence of the PR is there. I just need to format it. I just want to like go over, and if there are any major objections, like I think who's James, I don't know if you're there in the call. So is James there in the call? He and yeah, he's not there in the call. So I think the point is like we need to have a consensus and see. Obviously I need to reformat it, but I just wanted everyone to have a look and see if it makes sense. The resize, it tries to cover both on the file system resize. That's why there is a comment by James but that why do we need this on the node. Then and there's another comment by like so when we resize, the response also contains size. Like why should the let's try to go over one by one if we have time. So if you scroll down, then should this should this message have a volume attributes for field? So when we request a resize, like currently we don't essentially need like the controller doesn't need any special secret or anything to generally to resize, like, but it's possible that in some cases it might need, so we might have to update that one there. But and then the next comment is the when we resize, certain volume types require both the current size and the new size, because they require you to pass a difference, like 10 GB was the new size, 10 GB is the new size, existing size is 5 GB. So to resize, you need to say just extend by 5 GB. So that's why we have it there. I just but I think James is not there, so we're gonna have
Yeah, I think
Sorry,
James is
I'm on the call. Where's my input needed?
I was just talking about the resize proposal, and like I was just trying to go over like if there are any major like concerns that are left over. So one was that why do we need to pass the like the current capacity in bunch of places in the API. I was trying to explain that because some storage providers need you to specify the difference, like X minus Y to expand the volume.
Yeah, but isn't it possible that, like, why can't the plugin understand what the current size of the volume is? Like, why does that have to be pushed through the CSI API?
It might be, but it might that the volume itself can figure out, or it may not. So it's like, how to say, just it could be redundant in many cases. It could be useful in some cases. Let's say if the volume type doesn't have that introspection, obviously it should have, but
well, I think the volume plugin should definitely have that information, because the size information is returned during the create volume call. So the volume plugin has to be aware of that.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So we can drop that, I guess.
All right.
And then the last bit I just want to clarify was like the shrinking of volume is a very different thing, and it basically will, when we shrink the volume, it becomes like we cannot, like if we have to consider like can we use the same proposal for shrinking the volume, it becomes tricky fast actually, and I don't know if you wanted to consider those concerns in this one.
Yeah, I have a kind of comment on this one. Is it possible that expanding is also not possible? For example, some file system does not support expanding. Like, how do we capture those things? Like, should we ask them? I mean, I'm just asking the question here because I know like some file system does not support expanding.
They can. So in that case, there's no need of doing anything on the control on the node, right? In that case,
Okay.
So they might not. So there's a node get ID request that has the node capability will have this expand volume call, and it might not implement that node expand volume a RPC call, and then there's no action that will be needed on the node.
Yeah, but what if the scenario is that the plugin itself does support expanding, but only for a subset of the file systems? Like if the volume is having a file system that does not support expanding, then it cannot support resize like expanding. But in some other, if it's using some other file system that do support expanding, then it's capable of doing expanding.
Oh, you mean the same volume type having different two file systems,
right?
Where one requires and one doesn't require. So yeah, I don't like it's possible that like that's a good point. I would think that wouldn't it be possible for the plugin to like implement the expand volume node API call anyway and do a no op operation and just return success?
Yeah, I think the kind of the way we do that in CSI right now is we have this volume capability stuff. I'm not sure if we can leverage that to solve this issue, or there might be some other things that we need to introduce. I'm not sure. So I haven't looked into the detail of this, but this is just something that I threw out there. And
okay, yeah, that sounds fair. I think the if the like the whether the volume could be expanded or not depends on FS type and runtime. It's a little bit tricky to like put that in specs.
Yeah, I do have another question. So can we support, I mean, like when the CO should call this expanding, is it a requirement that the CO can only do this expanding when the volume is not in use, like not used by any workload? Or the CO can call that even if there's some workload still using the volume? Like, what's the guideline there? Like,
Yeah, I think the CSI, the spec itself doesn't say any guideline, but I think like the most file system and volume types I know, they support expanding even if it's the workload or the volume is in use in a workload. So, but the spec itself doesn't say, okay, that you need to do, does it? And I wasn't sure that if you need to provide a guidance to the
okay, yeah, I think the reason I ask is, like, say the volume is not in use, it's not used by any of the workload, it's not mounted somewhere.
Yeah.
Like, does the CO needs to call node publish to mount the volume first before it can call resize, or it does not have to? That the mount step is encoded inside this expand volume, like no component of the expand volume call. Like,
yeah, obviously the expand volume call on the node doesn't assume that the volume will be will not implicitly also mount the volume, because it needs a node. Even that call also requires a node, access to a node where the volume was already like CO has to schedule the volume to that node for some workload or for something. So the resize itself, like the file system, cannot happen without a workload, theoretically, like the file system resize. So the idea that I had in mind for that one is like, if the volume was offline, we do the controller resize, and whenever a workload starts and uses that volume, then it will be expanded during then the node, the call on the node will be made. If it is already online, then the CO can do it online. If the workload is online, it can determine that the volume is mounted, it can call the node expand volume. So those are the two scenarios. But if it is offline, it's not going to mount the volume and resize.
okay, yeah, I mean, I just want to ask those questions because it's not super clear by looking at the PR.
Okay.
Probably some more thinking there. Can someone take notes? Because all right. Do you want to go through the rest? Like any other things that you want to ask here? That's kind of controversial that you want to raise here.
Yeah, I think the one final thing was that okay, when the volume expansion is finished, then the node response, so the node expand volume response contains a capacity range again. So theoretically, like a lot of these fields could be dropped actually, like the capacity bytes, if you go to scroll down, scroll down. Yeah. So yeah, these two. Yeah. So stop. So the two fields is the capacity range in the, sorry, that is in the request.
I think this is the this is the request. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So James is saying, I'm not convinced this is needed really. The proposed controller already provides the field. So to expand the file system on the node, it's like you have to specify, either it's like you specify, if you don't specify size, then it expands up to whatever is the available space, or the second one is like you specify a size and it expands up to that size, right? So those are the reasons. That's why I included these fields in the request as well, like the current capacity. But I think the current capacity again could be dropped, as we discussed. And does anyone have any disagreement about like the new capacity, expected capacity to be passed as a parameter to the node expand volume request? Or James is saying that you can fetch from controller. The controller API provides a field, but the node will not have access to that, right? That parameter, like the controller, whatever that was passed. So we'll have to pass it again here when we.
I'd like to clarify that. So I think what I suggested, and we're looking at a different comment now, I think, than the one that we're talking about. But
yeah, this is the one.
what I suggested was that
Hmm.
we allow information to flow downstream from the controller service to the node service, just like we do for other parts of the API. So the node service wouldn't be calling the controller, but if we have two calls for resize, one on the controller and one on the node, then the response for the controller RPC could contain some kind of opaque expansion parameters, or whatever you want to call it, field. And then the call that would happen on the node would be the request to expand on the node could have that that set of parameters from the successful controller response. So I wanted to offer that clarification because it seemed like maybe that was misconstrued.
Okay. So how will the controller response? I'm just trying to think. Will flow onto the node. Like even if it was responded, then like the CO has to store it somewhere and then pass it back, right?
Yeah, I mean, just like it does for the other API calls. Like the CO
Okay.
has to take that information and then do something with it to get it down to the node. So, and you know, and this might be over-engineered too, right? Like, do we even need this expansion parameters? You know, I'm not really convinced that we do.
Yeah, the current capacity bytes we can drop it, but the expected like capacity range that we have, it's like it could be it's like it should be needed in many cases, like, and it may not be needed in some cases if we want the volume to expand to like the file system to expand to like whatever available size. So if we just don't pass in the size option in all the size argument and the expand call like resize to FS or XFS grow FS, then it expands up to the maximum available space. But if you want to,
so I think I understand what you're saying. I think I'm questioning the need for not expanding a file system to the full size of the volume of the underlying volume.
yeah.
I understand that command line tools offer that option, but I don't. Do we actually have a concrete use case for CSI for that?
Yeah.
And if we don't, then why over-engineer the API?
I was thinking more like if like the bunch of like resize to FS and XFS grow FS, these don't need a parameter and it expands to the fullest extent possible. But I don't know if there are other volume types or file system types where you must pass that as an argument. So I'll have to go back and look into if there are any like I don't know. There are other file systems like Btrfs or something that explicitly force you to specify that size options. That I kept that as a fail-safe mechanism.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, like if we don't have any concrete use case to drive some of these fields, then let's get rid of them. So.
Yeah, I'll look into that a little bit and see if there are any file system types that explicitly force you to specify. It'll be like, yeah, but that was the main reason.
Great, thanks.
Okay, I don't think I have anything other like particularly like controversial bits. I'll just update this proposal. I need to get on with the spec.md file. I was waiting for the.
Yeah, so just one, so Hema, I think from CO's perspective, I just want clarification on when we should, precisely when CO should call this, whether it's online, when the volume is offline. I really want to see that to be crystal clear in the spec, in the comments.
Okay.
So that's kind of general comments I have. Because from reading the PR right now, it's not clear to me when the CO should do that, whether the volume is online, offline, should we call no published volume or not? This is unclear to me. So it'd be nice to kind of add some description, like what's the expected CO behavior on that.
Okay, I'll address that. So there's 3 comments here and I'll address those in the PR.
All right, thanks.
I'd also like to call attention to a comment that I think Gustav left on the PR, which was related to specific file system support, and that maybe this is a Linux specific case that he's been thinking of, but generally there's a generic interface or a set of command line tooling to create file systems in Linux, right? You have makefs. Yeah. But resizing, you need specialized tools.
Yeah.
And so this PR, if a plugin wants to resize a volume, but they want to support multiple file systems, then now we're kind of adding, there's like some additional coupling now, like the tool has to be aware of specialized resize interfaces for those file systems, versus like a generic makeFS interface. So I'm not sure how people feel about that, but I just wanted to raise that point since I think we glossed over it.
Yeah, there's two things. One is that there are some higher level tools that are built on existing tools that offer you to like resize in general all the file system, but they are not installed by default on most operating systems, most Linux distros, and the low level tools that are provided by the file system themselves, like resize to FS or XFS, other things, you have to pretty much like switch case it at some point and somewhere, like either switch case or like create types or abstract it somehow. So in Kubernetes, we have pretty much like chosen to, like in its alpha feature in Kubernetes, so we have chosen to support just ext, star, and XFS. So, and we did not should we rely on the present, like if we need to rely on any other higher level tools like that build on these, then we'll have to install those tools on the operating system. So it may not be available. So I don't have any concrete idea about this one. It's just that we have to, like, the plugin authors will have to open code it, like switch case or like, yeah. So either switch.
All right. Okay. Okay. I think we have 30 minutes left, so I'm gonna switch to the next topic. Ardalan, are you there? You there? Oh yeah, I think this one is something that I copied from last time. Maybe Ardalan is not here, so we can. Okay, so Julian, you want to talk about this drain logic?
Yeah, so in Cloud Foundry, with our existing volume support, we have a state where the system is shutting down for whatever reason, like we're pushing out updates to the underlying software, and during that process, we call back into plugins to tell them that they should clean up any work they still have going. So it's very easy in this kinds of systems for the CO to get out of sync with the plugin in terms of their understanding of the state of the system. So you can end up with dangling mounts or leftover directories or things like that. So system shutdown is a point at which there shouldn't be any mounts, or there shouldn't be any dangling directories that used to be mount points, things like that. I'm just wondering if, like, we don't have similar RPC in CSI to say, hey, drain your workload. I'm wondering if there's kind of a standard convention people are thinking about for how we would do that with something like POSIX signals, or if this is actually a hole in the spec and we should put in a PR to add it.
So Julian, I have one question on this. So why the drain log needs to be handled by the plugin, not the CO? Like the alternative to me is like someone signal the CO, say, hey, I'm going to drain this node, and CO invoke relevant operations on the CSI plugin to kind of properly amount those volume. So
that's the normal case. Ideally, by the time you get to the point where you're draining, all the work should be evacuated. But all of this stuff is failure prone, right? Network connections, or maybe race conditions, or whatever. It's very easy to end up in a state where you did a detach or an unmount and it was unsuccessful because something wasn't done yet. You try 6 times, whatever, it doesn't happen. Now you're left with the plugin having knowledge of something that didn't get undone, and the CO has given up. So it's essentially a way it's a point at which we know there should be nothing mounted and nothing attached, right? And so it's essentially a way of kind of cleaning up. And what we found in practice is if we don't do this, then we end up with cruft accumulating on VMs.
So what's the reason that the CO tries to do cleanup using the normal CSI RPCs, but it fails? So if I understand correctly, you're saying that those cleanup operations fails and CO give up, and you want some mechanism to tell the plugin saying that, oh, this node is done, please do whatever the cleanup you need it to clean up the rest of the stuff. I'm just curious why the cleanup will fail when CO using the normal RPCs, but it will success when you do the string logic. Like, what's the scenario?
So the difference is largely going to be around timing, right? Like if you have something that's in use, sometimes unmount doesn't work, right? And you can kind of force it, but then that's just a decision. Like, do we want to? And it's because all of this is kind of kernel level stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't quite work the way you expect it to, and then the CO has to decide, well, like, how many times we want to try to call unmount and get back error responses, or or node detach or whatever.
But okay, so then my question is, does the CO needs to wait for this cleanup to finish from the plugin, like, or CO just issue a signal to the plugin and then just give up and signal the system administrator saying that the node has been shut down and you can terminate the VM?
Right. So the way this works for us in Cloud Foundry is, you have a drain step for every process that gets installed, and that gets given a certain amount of time to shut itself down in an orderly fashion. And then if it doesn't, if it takes too long, then it just gets blown out of the water. And typically, the idea is that with a system that's kind of distributed, had many processes running, you want to get them all to shut down in an orderly fashion first, so everybody drains, and then once everybody's drained, then you go around and kill everybody. And if drain takes too long, then you give up and you start shooting processes in the head. I got to imagine that there's very similar mechanisms in Mathos and Kubernetes, but if you're shutting down a node, these things, I guess, are running in containers, but does the container get notified with a POSIX signal in some way, or?
Yeah, usually it's like you have a grace period, right? You give a SIG term asking you have a grace period. You give a SIG term to the container saying that, hey, the container is being shutting down, and you need to do some cleanup if it's not response. If the container is not terminated in like the grace period, then it will be a SIG killed. So that's kind of the typical way of doing shutting down.
Maybe that's good enough, right? Maybe that's all we need. It is essential.
I think, but it's problematic for CSI because like we don't really how do we get the PID, for example? Which process do you send the signal to? So that part is.
I think the CO knows best when there's no container using the volume, right? And what is the right time to attempt to unmount. The plugin, all the plugin knows is that it's mounted. It doesn't know when the volume is could be unmounted.
Yeah, I think what Julian kind of saying is like, this is kind of the last level of defense where the CO know for sure that everything has been killed. All the container on this node has been killed. There's no workload anymore on this node. but somehow some cleanup RPC in the CSI timeout and still don't know what to do, but the CO is shutting down anyway. So this just give the plugin a last signal saying that, oh, I'm shutting down, please do whatever. I mean, it's always going to be best effort to me, I think.
Yeah. So I mean, another way to think about this is maybe the node plugin is doing some bookkeeping, right? So it thinks it knows what's running on the node.
Yeah.
Even if the CO has gone through with a hammer and forcibly unmounted all of the mount points that it gave to the plugin and scrubbed them up, the node plugin may still believe that there are mounts at that location because of some bookkeeping it's doing. So this is a point at which we know, okay, this node is about to shut down. There should be nothing running on it. And I guess for us, we found that to be valuable because we don't really have a lot of other opportunities, you know, so you get like startup and shutdown. And those are the 2 points where you know fairly concretely that there's no workloads on this node.
Yeah, I can see that being useful in some cases. But I think like using signal is probably not a good idea because then we have to define like what's the process. Like we have to, the CO has to know about the process ID of the process to send a signal to. And it's currently like the spec didn't say anything about the process ID.
Right, just sending a sig term to the container itself might be not what you want.
Yeah, I mean, I can see like having an RPC, like you send in RPC through the same domain socket. So that's one way.
Yeah, maybe I'll. If people agree that this is a valid use case, then we can put in a quick PR. I think it should be very small, right? I mean, it doesn't really need a whole lot of parameters or anything. Maybe a parameter saying you have 30 seconds or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key here is clearly define when this RPC should be called by the CO. Like, I'm a CO implementer. I want to know like when should I call this RPC?
Sure.
If we have a new one, and like we need to precisely define those timing.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I like the idea of an RPC. I think we already have a way in the spec to drain a volume. Like there's a way to say detach this volume, doesn't matter where it's attached to, right? But there's no way to say drain this node. So, so I like that. It does seem like a hole in the spec to me. And I agree with Chi that we should try to avoid using signals.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, we have eventually to support Windows anyway, so so signals would cause issues there. All right. So we'll put in a PR then.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Julian. All right, Alan, are you there or hello? No. Okay, so if not, then we can only discuss next time on this thing. Any other things that folks want to discuss today?
I had a question that I wanted to raise if nobody else has anything. So.
All right, looks like no. So go ahead, James.
Yes, we have this probe call, and I think in the latest version of the spec, we said that probe was going to be kind of like a health check. So I was looking at some of the code for the CSI LBM plugin, and there's a bunch of work that happens when the plugin boots up to set up a volume group or maybe tear down a volume group. And if you look at the order in which things happen, during that, again, I'm going to call it bootstrapping, right? It like listens on a socket, and then it does some setup work, and then it registers some RPC services. You say, oh, well, maybe the setup work can be done asynchronously, so there's less delay between the time that, you set up that socket and the socket actually responds to RPCs. But then you've got this probe call coming in, and like, what does it mean for setup to be ongoing while you get a probe? Right? Is probe returning healthy because the plugin hasn't crashed yet, but it might later? but but it hasn't, right? So it's healthy, or is it like ready, or versus not ready? Because if setup's still ongoing, then and we want to use probe as like readiness, then probe would return some kind of error indicating that it wasn't ready, and then when setup finishes, probe could return success because now it's ready. So I don't know. It seems to me like probe might be a little more useful if if it offered more nuanced information. But I don't want to bloat the spec either. So I was kind of just wondering if anyone else has kind of thought about this and has kind of run into something similar, or ideas of how it should work. I think Saad was the advocate for kind of the latest incarnation of the probe API. I'm a little sad he's not on the call, but maybe somebody else has some ideas.
When I read the spec, I thought it was strange that it was written like a basic ping, but then it has the big caveat that says this is actually really expensive ping. I might have made two separate APIs, like just a ping that just says this just pings and make sure you're still there, but it needs to be cheap, and then something else that says go do some expensive checking, and then tell me how you're doing.
I'm trying to remember the discussion we had around that. We were back and forth about this RPC, about whether or not it was useful at all. And even Saad, I think, was a little on the fence, and kind of came around to the idea that we would use it as a periodic health check. I think that caveat was intended to, just to say, hey, don't call this before every RPC because you can't assume that it's trivial. I suspect that in most cases it will be pretty trivial. But in the spirit of backward compatibility, I think it's probably too late to take it out. So yeah, having a state that says initializing seems like a useful extension to me.
Well, I mean, I guess my question is like, James, so can we just not return the response when when the CO do probe until the initialization is over?
Yeah, that's certainly an option, right? Like probe could just block.
Uh-huh.
And then, if the client times out, it could just reissue a probe.
Yeah.
Or if the client gets impatient, it could decide to kill. If the CO gets impatient, it could decide to kill the plugin. Which seems problematic, because if the plugin's in the middle of doing some setup work and the CO kills it, like it might have to restart that setup work. And so I can see the case where a plugin just crash loops because the CO is not giving it enough time to do its work.
Well, I think the CO should not kill the plugin if the probe does not give you a response. If you give you a failure, CO can kill it and restart it. But I don't think the CO should kill the container or restart a container when the probe is pending. Don't have a response.
I actually think it would be useful to have an initializing state as opposed to making it synchronous, basically. Only because if we send a probe and we don't get a response back, that could be caused by all kinds of network interference, right? I mean, it could. There's a lot of steps in the network that could cause that behavior, like maybe like DNS isn't responding or something like that.
Yeah, in which case the CO should just call probe again, trying to get either a success or a failure.
You need to be able to tell the difference between the plugin is setting up versus plugin has gone out to lunch. Like, how do you tell the difference between that if it just blocks?
Exactly. So we can't if we respond with a hey, I'm initializing response, then the CO knows, hey, this seems to be a healthy plugin. It's just not ready yet. Versus if it hangs, then the CO doesn't have any idea whether this plugin's ever going to respond right. I mean, it could be, Amazon is down, right? or whatever. So to me, it seems like it has more utility if we treat this as a polling thing and we try to get it to respond quickly.
Can we rather than extending the probe response, can we change the error code that it returns and add something like unavailable, so that like it's responding, but it's not available yet. And once the plugin is done initializing, the unavailable will obviously will disappear.
Yeah, I think that's what that's sort of roughly the proposal, right? I don't
No, I'm just saying that we don't have to expand the spec itself for that, because it could be just a gRPC error code.
Yeah.
So like
Yeah, I mean, error code should be part of the spec too.
oh, yeah.
Okay, I guess like I'm curious, like, I mean, what Kubernetes is doing right now regarding this RPC? Anyone knows about that? Like when this RPC will be invoked for a given plugin?
In Kubernetes?
Yeah, like when Kubernetes will issue this RPC to the plugin?
We haven't, as far as I know, we haven't decided yet. That's something I can discuss in the next meeting with Vladimir.
Yeah.
Meeting.
Yeah, we don't call that call.
Yeah.
As far as I see.
Yeah, I mean,
Saad
from
saying you
our
wanted
side,
to wire
from
it up
this side,
to liveness or what's the other? There's two different Kubernetes probes. I thought Saad wanted to hook it up to one or the other, but I don't know if that's been done.
Check the Liveness probe sidecar container. 1 second. You guys can keep talking.
So, if we're done with this topic, I had a follow up to my earlier one.
Okay.
So, well, are we done?
Yeah, I think we probably need some more thinking on this, because I don't know. It would be nice to understand what CO are doing right now regarding this RPC to understand the use cases, and then do a reconciliation, see what we should do for this call.
Yeah, the spec for this one could certainly be clear about what use case this is trying to address.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I'm happy to file a PR that we can fight over or debate or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, that I think that would be nice.
Okay.
I added a link. You may want to add it to the document. Liveness probe sidecar container does use probe.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
So Hemant, this is Ben again. I looked at your PR where you proposed the get node info instead of get node ID, and it still doesn't have a mechanism for returning opaque strings. So we could extend this thing and add more defined strings, but what's really needed is a way to return opaque strings that are sort of specific to the plugin that the CO doesn't need to know anything about.
Yeah, so the idea was we could add the plan was to expand that, extend the spec to cover that need, like to have a opaque parameter like key value pair, but we did not add it then and there right then because we didn't have a concrete need at that time. So I would say that like we should have to open a follow-up PR and extend that like what we want to put, like for example, like the IP addresses or the all the invariant data. So
but whether we return a bunch of IP addresses or an IQN, I don't think that should be encoded into the spec. I think it should just be an opaque string map that the node returns that the controller then can consume, and then that allows people who are implementing these things to pass information from their node to their plugin that nobody else cares about.
Yes,
Ben,
yes.
Ben, let's say that you get an opaque, let's say that you get a set of opaque fields from node info. Like we add that in as some part of some future API. What APIs and CSI would you imagine consume that field?
So the specific case I'm thinking about is if you're doing an iSCSI based plugin, and when you do the controller publish, part of that is supposed to be going to the actual storage controller and making that LUN available to the specific node that will consume it, which usually involves adding the IQN for that node to some ACL, or some authorization map. And so at that time, the controller needs to know the IQN of the node, but it doesn't have any way to get that unless it already got it ahead of time.
So in that specific use case, does the controller need to know anything else? I'm just wondering if we added this get node ID thing in order to allow nodes to say something about themselves to the controller for purposes of identification, and this seems to be clearly a use case for that, right?
If that's what the node ID is meant to be, then we could probably document that, and then in that case, the only real problem is it's limited to 128 characters, and I could imagine a situation where that wouldn't be enough to send the blob of data that the controller needs from the node back.
Can you elaborate on the concrete case that 128 is not enough? Because if it's not, we can bump it. But
if you're doing NFS and there's a list of IP addresses because the host has multiple NICs, or one could imagine a situation where there was more than one IQN. I think that would be rare, but there could be situations where you had lists of things that needed to get returned back to the node because you needed to grant access to all of the IPs on the node or all of the IQNs on the node in order for multipathing to work, for example. Right. So I usually 128 will probably cover us, but I'm just worried that we're going to find situations where you really need to pass more opaque data back. And so a list or a map or something that just let nodes send whatever they needed back to the controller. And it would be opaque because no one else would care.
It's funny, we used to have, node ID used to be a map, and we simplified it to a string. So we're like, oh, a map is overkill.
It's probably overkill in 95% of cases, but
yeah,
but what about the other 5%?
Yeah, well, I think
the philosophy I think we've been trying to keep is it's much easier for us to expand things than it is for us to shrink them. So if it turns out 128 is not enough, or hey, we need an additional parameter that's the map for some concrete use case, then we can add that when we hit it. So I think we were just kind of assuming this is probably going to do it in the cases we know about today. So I guess I'm a little leery of just expanding this in the just in case type manner.
How will this data flow from node to the controller? When can you expand, or can you expand on that? If let's say if NFS requires a list of servers, then how?
Well, today the CO calls the get node ID and stashes that in some stable storage, and then when you call controller publish, you get that node ID back out in the controller plugin. And if you're using it to stash the IQN, which we do today, then that works. But if you have 2 IQNs or 3 IQNs, or if the IQN is super long for whatever reason, then it would fail.
Is that the only RPC that you need the no ID information or no info, information, the controller publish? Is there any other call you need that information?
I haven't thought of anything yet.
Okay.
But that's the only one we've needed it so far.
Okay, I see. Okay. Yeah, I think adding opaque map. I mean, I didn't look at the get no info on PR yet. So I need to look at that. But I think in general, adding an opaque map to me is kind of it's okay. That's something that we do. I mean, as James said, no ID is used to be a map, and then we kind of make that a string to make sure that's ID, not any additional information. But sounds like we have a no info right now, so having a map totally makes sense. Okay. All right. I think we're right on time, and I guess see you guys in next week. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Thanks. Thank you very much. See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.